I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to a new season, I believe the 33rd of the New York Times Close Up. On this program, we feature leading newsmakers and New York Times journalists who cover them. This week, we'll talk about the trend in decreasing college enrollment among men. Why is it happening, and how is it changing life on campus? But before that, I'd like to welcome a 2006 Pulitzer Prize-winning writer. He's been having a bit of a moment lately. The biography, American Prometheus, which won the Pulitzer, was the inspiration behind this summer's blockbuster film, Oppenheimer. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the theoretical physicist, widely understood to be the father of the atomic bomb, helped bring an end to the devastating Second World War, also ushered in a new conversation surrounding the ethics of scientific discovery. Here to discuss the book, the historical importance of the biography, and the new film, Kai Bird, co-author of American Prometheus, head of the Leon Levy Center for Biography at the CUNY Graduate Center. Thank you for joining us, Kai. And this book was written 18 years ago. Janet Maslin in the New York Times called it a work of voluminous scholarship and lucid insight. You watched the movie this summer for the first time, 3-hour movie. How faithful is it to the book?
Oh, it's an incredible movie. It's, a cinematic performance, a great artistic achievement, but it's very faithful to the book, and that's a miracle in Hollywood for most biographers.
It is indeed. What was your role in the film? I mean, obviously you watched it, you oversaw it to some extent. Did you ever say, whoa, wait a minute, that didn't happen that way, or this would be a better way of doing it? How did that work?
I have to say I had very little involvement in the actual making of the film. I was invited to be on set at one point. And before they started filming, Christopher Nolan met with me here in New York and escorted me into a hotel room in Greenwich Village, handed me the screenplay, and said, take as long as you need to read it. Well, it was 180 pages, and it took me 3.5 hours to read this script. And I was blown away. It's an amazing achievement. He manages to synthesize the highlights of this very long 700-plus page biography of a very complicated figure, Robert Oppenheimer, and he transforms it into a cinematic experience that's also faithful to the history. It's just, I read the script and I think I had 2 small little suggestions. Otherwise, I just told him it was brilliant.
Pretty impressive. When people finish reading the book, and if you haven't read it, you should, and if you haven't seen the film, you should, but when people read the book, see the film, what do you want them to walk away with?
I want them to question what happened in history. I want them to argue about the history, argue about the end of World War II, how it happened, whether the atomic bomb was necessary or not, the nature of this special weapon. And I want them to also come away, half the movie is devoted to what happens to Oppenheimer after World War II, after he's celebrated as America's most famous scientist, the father of the atomic bomb. 9 years later, he is brought down in this humiliating kangaroo court of a security hearing and publicly humiliated. And he becomes sort of the chief victim of the McCarthy, celebrity victim of the McCarthy era. And I want people to revisit McCarthyism because it explains a lot of our current divisive politics. It's still a living part of our history and a very important part of our history. As you know, you've written about the Rosenberg case, for instance. That's still, something that we all live with, and the seeds of what happened during the McCarthy era have sprouted in our current politics that have become really ugly and partisan and divisive.
So when you were writing the book, and obviously 18 years later when you see the film again, Did it change your mind of whatever preconceptions you had before you started? Should we have dropped the bomb? Should we have done something different? Easy to second guess, of course.
Right. Well, Oppenheimer was motivated to build this weapon of mass destruction because he feared that the German physicists, whom he knew very well, were just as capable of building it as he was. And so it was a race. He didn't want Hitler to get it. And after the war, soon after the war, he realized from intelligence briefings how close the Japanese were to actually surrendering. So that raised some difficult questions about whether the bomb was actually necessary, whether it actually ended the war. The movie doesn't hammer you over the head with any thesis, but it plants questions. And, as I said, I think that's what we want to achieve as a biographer, and what Christopher Nolan, I think, wanted to achieve. He wanted people to question what happened and to dig into it and learn more about our history. So,
why is the atomic bomb, nuclear weaponry, the H-bomb, such a moral threshold? I mean, we had the firebombing of Dresden, of Tokyo. We say we don't want to use cluster bombs.
Right.
What difference does it make how we kill people?
Yeah, no, good question. And Oppenheimer, 3 months after Hiroshima, gave a public speech in Philadelphia where he said some amazing things. He said, "You may think that this weapon was very expensive because we spent $2 billion to create it. It's actually very cheap. You may think that we have a monopoly on this. Actually, there are no secrets to its creation. The physics is known. It's simply an engineering problem. And it is a weapon for aggressors. It's not a defensive weapon. And it's a weapon of terror. And it's one bomb that can destroy a whole city. And if it's ever used again, it could lead to Armageddon." So he was, right after the war, trying to warn us of the dangers and of the difficulty of living in the atomic age. So that's another reason why the film and the book are so relevant to our current times. We're facing a war in the Ukraine, in the heart of Europe, and Vladimir Putin is threatening to use tactical nuclear weapons, and what could that lead to? We can only imagine. So these are very tough questions that Oppenheimer himself, the father of the atomic bomb, was asking within months of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And they're still very relevant today.
He said another war would be unthinkable because of the atomic bomb. Obviously, we've had wars, lots of people have been killed on all sides, but we haven't had a nuclear war. So was he right in a sense?
Well, he's been right so far. We've survived the nuclear age. We haven't used these weapons in anger, in combat. But the story's not over. And knowing human history and foibles of human nature, and knowing the potential for accidents, it could still end badly. My co-author, the late Marty Sherwin, who spent 25 years on this book. His last book before he died in 2021 was called Gambling with Armageddon. And it's the best book ever written about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the theme of it was that we were just damn lucky to have survived. It was out of pure luck. We had no idea that the Russians had tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba and were prepared to use them on the ground. And so it's again a stark warning that the story's not over and we have to not be complacent about these weapons.
And there are so many cases, some of which we're just learning about, that there were close calls when each side thought the other was about to use nuclear weapons. Turned out not necessarily to be true. In a story in the Times, I think by Dennis Overby, he interviewed Christopher Nolan, the director and writer, and pointed out in the production notes for the film, he said, like it or not, J. Robert Oppenheimer is the most important person who ever lived. Would you agree with that? He said that, isn't the most important person the person who pushes the button, but Nolan said you had to have the button, and Oppenheimer invented that.
Yes. Well, it's a very broad statement, and I have to say I was sort of taken aback when I first read it myself as the biographer. But, you think about it, and yes, this is the physicist who gave us the atomic age that we're still living with. And as such, he gave us the possibility of destroying our own world. And that's, by definition, a pretty important life to understand. And, I think Oppenheimer is important, but he's also endlessly fascinating and an enigma and a personality, he's sort of a scientific nerd, but also as a young man, he had a fascination and a love of French poetry and the novels of Ernest Hemingway. He was a polymath, and his life is just incredibly interesting and mysterious. And so I think that's reflected in the film that Nolan has produced this summer.
You've written recently a terrific biography of Jimmy Carter. You're working on a biography now of Roy Cohn. Why do we care about biography? Why do we care about other people's lives? You're head of the Leon Levy Center for Biography at CUNY Grad Center. Why should we care about how other people lived?
Well, human beings can't exist without telling stories to each other. This is how we understand our world. And biography just happens to be the most compelling vehicle for telling history. And it's also the most difficult. It takes a minimum of 5 to 10 years to produce a biography. And yet it's compelling as a vehicle because you're reading about one person's life. And you inevitably empathize with their struggle. And you keep turning the page. And along the way, you learn a lot of history and context. So it's an important art. And at the Leon Levy Center for Biography, that's our job, is to sort of promote and encourage the art and craft of biography and encourage biographers in their lonely pursuit of telling lives.
And your students who have come out of the center have produced many great biographies as well. So obviously you've succeeded. Kai Bird, the author of American Prometheus, the basis for the film Oppenheimer. Thank you so much for joining us. Coming up next, the decreasing number of American men going to college. How come? School is officially underway. This week, the New York Times Magazine publishes its education issue. For men, the news not so great, and it's getting worse. The college enrollment gender gap continues to widen. Men are increasingly less likely to enroll in college than women are, even less likely to earn their degree. New York Times Magazine staff writer Susan Dominus covers this story for the magazine. She joins us now to discuss what's behind the trend, why it's important in an age when affirmative action is on the defense and when women are still looking for a larger voice. Susan, why is this happening and what's the significance of it?
Well, I should start by saying that the truth is it's actually a very long-standing trend, and it doesn't seem to be reversing. It seems incrementally moving in an increasingly wide gap direction. But one of the main reasons, I think, is an economic reason, which is that men right out of high school typically can earn more than women do when they graduate from high school. The kinds of professions that men go into, such as construction, can be very, very lucrative. But a lot of the jobs that pay that well for women, you kind of need a college degree. So for example, nursing, or even teaching. So part of it is an economic reason. There are some people who believe that boys, for one reason or another, are at a disadvantage at school from the time they start, that they're less ready for kindergarten, that they're developmentally on a different pace. And therefore they kind of become a little bit disenchanted with school more than girls do, that there's a kind of cascading effect. And that by the time they're, graduating, there's a really wide difference in how they feel about school generally. So, and there's also a little bit of a war on gender ideology, a conservative war on the gender ideology happening on college campuses. And, so it starts to feel like there's something anti-masculine about higher ed in some circles, I think.
So in general, in terms of smarts, in terms of the job market, does every male need to go to college?
Increasingly, there's economic research that Paul Tough writes about in the same issue, that the calculation of whether to go into debt for college versus the wages that you could earn at 18 for the rest of your life, it's no longer as straightforward as it used to be. It used to be that long term, it was clear that if you had a college education, you were going to earn more over the course of your lifetime. But I think that there are other benefits that come from a college education that have to do with a deeper understanding of the world. I mean, there's even research that ties higher IQ to more years of learning. I think a well-educated populace is something that, shouldn't be a luxury in a country as wealthy as the United States.
One of the things that's so interesting about your piece in the Times Magazine is that you quote college admissions officers as admitting that they've got their thumb on the scale in many cases for male applicants. What's the difference between that and affirmative action?
There's not a huge difference, except that, of course, men were not historically discriminated against. I think that they wouldn't be allowed to do this because of Title IX, which demands equality and educational opportunity for men and for women. The reason why private schools can continue to do this is because there is an exemption in Title IX specifically for admissions, so that schools could kind of create a gender composition that made sense for them at the time that Title IX passed. Princeton didn't want it to go from being all men to 50% women overnight, and they wanted to sort of get people used to the idea. Women's colleges wanted to be able to stay women's colleges. So there is this exemption that still stands. State schools, I think don't have, it's really for private colleges. State schools don't have the same luxury. And you're more likely to see, it is often the case that there are more women than men at state schools, whereas, there's a feeling that there's some gender balancing going on at very elite schools and private schools.
So are schools admitting men who aren't up to the qualifications, the standards of some of the women who apply?
I am quite sure that every man who gets into Harvard, Princeton, and Yale is going to do just fine and is probably extraordinary. Truly, there, so many people are applying that, you're picking the creme de la creme. Somebody did say to me that he thought that if gender were stripped from the applications at these elite schools, that the ratio would still be more like 60-40, because girls do just tend to perform better in high school. And, the historical gap in standardized testing has narrowed. Girls actually score higher than boys on the ACT now, tiny bit. I mean, they're basically the same. But I do think that there is some concern also at, non-selective schools that I don't write about this in my piece, but I have read accounts in which professors have said that they felt like some of the young men being admitted, couldn't really perform at a college level.
So how do colleges and universities attract more male applicants?
Well, that is the big question. And I think there are, efforts to some schools have embedded people, admissions or college advisors in disadvantaged communities to try to build those relationships or create kind of a pipeline. Another main thing is sports. They really, there's this sense that if a kid can play football at one school and not at another, everyone's fighting for these young men. So if you don't have a football team, maybe you add a football team, even though it can be very expensive, and even though it's dangerous for the kids, obviously, and even though it is not clear that it keeps enrollment high indefinitely. It seems to increase enrollment for a year or two, and then it tends to level off, according to some research. But there is this feeling that you must have sports to attract young men. There's also a lot of marketing to, directly lead to young men. I have a quote from somebody talking about a school where they created what they called the brochure, BRO-sure, shots of young men shoving cake in their face and football.
Oh, that'll do it. All right. That'll.
Yeah, well, I think that there is a sense that you want boys to see themselves on the campus, that they feel like they belong, there, that their values or their sense of humor is represented. Maybe other schools also have more imagery around STEM and tech and engineering. We do know that schools that have great engineering programs, great business programs, great computer science programs, they don't have a problem attracting men. If they're really known for those programs, they can attract men.
Susan, what is the ideal goal? Does it have to be 50-50? Is that what schools are aiming for?
That is the gold standard. That is what many times admissions officers I spoke mostly, I should say, to former admissions officers who felt they could speak freely, but, and some of them, had worked in admissions offices several years ago, but some as recently as 3 years ago. But I think, yes, the term you heard a lot was the North Star is 50-50 at a lot of schools. There's the fear that if you get to 60-40, that it'll spiral, that, now that it feels heavy on girls. So young women who are interested in female heavy will apply and fewer men will apply, or that young women who want an even balance will stop applying to schools if the ratio gets to be, as is the case at the College of Charleston in South Carolina, 68% female. So, there's not a ton of research to support this, by the way. It's just the sort of common wisdom, Tulane is, I think, something like 64, 65, 66% female, depending on the year average. But they seem to be still very, very popular, very, very hot school. And I'm sure people get a tremendous education there.
And Susan, what's the impact of life on campus, on dating, on the feeling that men have the perception of themselves on campus?
What I was hearing from women who attended campuses where this ratio is very skewed is that they did feel like the men, the heterosexual men had a kind of control over the terms of dating on campus, and that those terms were not necessarily ones that the young women I was interviewing found acceptable. It was very transactional, it was very fleeting, it was, very much hookup culture, which is prevalent on college campuses everywhere now. But at the same time, I think these young women, one had even talked about it in her gender studies class at Tulane. She felt that the ratio did make for what she called a disgusting, she found trying to date at Tulane disgusting. That was the word she used.
You talk about gender neutral sports as one sort of solution. What are esports?
They start a varsity team and you get together and you play Valorant or other games that I don't know that much about. And you compete against other schools, and they even give scholarships to e-athletes now. And what's nice about this, if you were going to add a men's football team because of Title IX, you might have to add like a women's sport. And that's a lot of roster spots. You might not even be able to do that, to afford that. But because esports is ostensibly neutral, gender neutral, you don't necessarily have to add more spots for women. It's open to women, and but really only 8% of esport varsity athletes tend to be women.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us. Susan Dominus, the New York Times Magazine, the education issue this week. And coming up next, I'll share some personal thoughts on a former City College student who became New York's most cerebral senator. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, New York's most cerebral United States senator and a son of City College, was blessed with unconventional curiosity and common sense, which makes you wonder how he would have fared in today's political climate. He barely survived in the 1960s and 70s, when liberals pummeled him for saying that the acrimonious issue of race could benefit from a period of benign neglect. They didn't bother to listen to the rest of what he said, that de-escalating the rhetoric surrounding the crisis of racial inequality didn't mean reducing the efforts to solve it. His goal was to reconcile what government could do about certain problems with the attention it draws to them. Conservatives in Congress, meanwhile, scuttled Moynihan's radical family assistance plan, a plan he persuaded President Nixon to endorse, a plan that would have provided welfare to dependent children. He said later about welfare reforms, quote, "Here in Washington, the prevailing view is that we have these problems because we tried to do something about them. And if you just don't try, the problem will go away. There's a certain truth in this," he said. "If you do not feed children for a certain period of time, they will go away." This week, the Moynihan Center was officially inaugurated at City College. Let's hope its faculty prods its students bent on careers in public service to adopt the Moynihan mantra, that people are entitled to their own opinions, but not to their own facts, and that it's not ignorance that hurts so much as knowing all those things that ain't so. Moynihan would also have tried to put today's politics in historical perspective. When President Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, the columnist Mary McGrory lamented what she called the end of Camelot. "We'll never laugh again," she said, to which Moynihan replied, "Heavens, Mary, of course we'll laugh again. It's just that we'll never be young again." For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.